Awesome. So welcome to our April Coffee and Chat, which is called In This Together, Transgender Rights and Abortion Rights. We are so lucky today to be joined by Aspen Ruhlin from the Mabel Wadsworth Center in Bangor, where they are a patient and community advocate. And I'm going to have Aspen introduce themselves a little more, but we will be here until 1:30 today Eastern time, and this will be available after if folks have to head out early. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Aspen.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen if it wants to cooperate. Oh, it does. A Christmas miracle. Now to get to the right tab, please hold. That's wrong. I'm actually going to stop sharing for just a second to get the right tab up. There we go. Been doing these Zooms for a while. We all still struggle sometimes. I want to thank everyone again for being here today, and thank you, Kate, for the introduction. As said, I'm Aspen. I use they, them pronouns. I am the client and community advocate at Mabel Wadsworth Center in Bangor, Maine. I'll talk a little bit more about Mabel Wadsworth Center, but what I do in my role, I do a mix of working directly with clients of ours. A lot of that work is focused specifically on trans folks and access to gender affirming care. And then I also do a lot of community engagement work with workshops like this, as trans inclusion within abortion access is a particular interest of mine and something really important to me. I also do a lot of work around sex education, and a little bit about me outside of this work. I also very much enjoy gardening and embroidery, and I'm actually a recently certified master gardener, which I feel the need to bring up in all presentations because I need to brag about it and I'm excited. So community agreements. These are things that I find just helpful to keep in mind when we're in this space learning together. And I really mean learning together. We all have things to learn. Just because I am leading this doesn't mean that I know everything. So first, honoring identity. That can come out in a lot of different ways. One very obvious way is, using people's name that we know works for them, using people's correct pronouns that they've identified, things like that. But also keeping in mind, what someone's lived experiences around a topic, their own social or cultural background, things like that, and just honoring those things. Come with good intentions, but also acknowledge and address impact. Impact and intent aren't the same thing. In education spaces, in fighting for our rights spaces, there's sometimes this idea that intent is the most important, but impact is important as well. An analogy I like is, let's pretend if this was in person, if I was walking by Kate and I stepped on her foot, I would be expected to apologize and try not to do that again. We can all agree it would be rude and frankly weird if I refuse to even acknowledge that it happened, let alone apologize, simply because I didn't mean to. And I think if we keep, that idea in mind with impact not equaling intent, that can make it easier to approach that in a way that's helpful for everyone. Take space, make space. If you are someone who has a harder time asking questions, but you have questions, maybe you're just more shy, try to take up more space, try to ask those questions. Like Kate said, we can pop those in the chat. There is time built in for questions. I even have a special slide at the end as a reminder of it. But also make space. If you are someone like me who has a really easy time talking and asking questions, trying to take a step back to make space for others who don't have as easy of a time. That doesn't mean everyone's restricted to you get one question. No. just be aware. And one that I find really important, this is a growing space and growth can feel uncomfortable sometimes. There are a couple of things that I'll point out that when this idea was first presented to me, I was really resistant to it, maybe felt a bit defensive. Oh, and also folks can mute their mics. That is also helpful. I meant to mention that sooner. But yeah, we all experience that. Sometimes we're resistant to an idea because it's really not a good one, but we need to take a step back if we're feeling challenged and really ask ourselves what the root of it is. It can also be that we simply don't have all of the information, but we think we do. So sometimes we just need to know more. So what is Mabel Wadsworth Center? I imagine that there are some folks here, definitely Kate, who's very familiar with what Mabel Wadsworth Center is. And then there are folks who are not familiar. So we opened in 1984, having that really strong focus on being a sexual and reproductive health center. So really being, a publicly available abortion provider, STI testing, contraception, other sexual health care. The reason we use the language of sexual and reproductive health center is very deliberate. We don't really use family planning as our language. Now, nothing wrong with that language. There are plenty of family planning clinics that I adore. But one of our founders, Terry, nurse practitioner, before Mabel's opened, she, was doing her thing. And she had a patient who was coming to her for a few years, this woman, who was seeing her for annual STI testing, gyno care, and contraception. And finally, after she'd been seeing her for a few years, this patient one day was like, Terry, I don't actually need birth control. I'm a lesbian. My partner's a woman. We can't get pregnant. But I thought that I had to pretend to need birth control to get this care. And that was really impactful on the importance of using language to make sure people know where they're welcomed and where they can get care. And so that's something that we've really incorporated into our mission. We've also expanded our services and the folks that we serve over the years. So like I said, we still do abortion care, contraception, STI testing, but we've expanded into gender affirming hormone therapy, into primary care, mental health. I do client advocacy and more. So unsurprisingly, working with trans folks is a big part of what we do.
Aspen, sorry, I just wanted to check really quick about pacing and speed with the interpreter. Does that feel okay? I just wanted to double check. Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for checking. So we are a health center. Obviously, we provide healthcare. We also do community engagement because being part of our community is really important. Obviously, that includes things like this, other workshops. I recently did a workshop on sex education and queer inclusion within that, but we also like to be involved in local events like Pride and tabling at the Common Ground Fair. Being a part of our community is really important. We also have a podcast, Reproductive Left, that Kate has been interviewed on. The healthcare part is really important of what we do, but so is really being involved in our community. So this is a question that I really like to ask in my workshops. People can share this in the chat if they want to. You do not have to share this in the chat. This is more for you to reflect on. So what is your first positive memory of a trans person? Followed with, what is your first negative memory of a trans person? When I ask these questions in workshops, I have noticed a trend. Now, the exact examples tend to vary by age, but it tends to be almost universally that people's first negative memory of a trans person is something from media, some sort of movie or show like Silence of the Lambs or Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, and happened fairly early in life, while their first positive memory of a trans person was actually meeting a trans person and happened later in life. This is pretty standard and very much explains the transphobia that exists in our culture. We did not decide how we were taught to view trans people. We didn't choose that, but we can decide to learn and grow once we're aware of this. So I'm going to actually give two examples, my own and that of a friend of mine. So for me, like with many trans people, the answer to these questions is actually more complicated. In my case, it's the same memory for both positive and negative. So when I was around 10 years oldish, not sure exactly, there was all kinds of national media coverage of the world's first pregnant man. Now, he was not the world's first pregnant man. He was a trans man who was the first pregnant trans man to get a lot of attention. There had been pregnant trans men before him. There have been several pregnant trans men after him. I was going to say I know some pregnant trans men. I don't, because they have since had their babies. But there was all of this national media coverage. And where this is positive is that, I was 10. I did not have any language for myself as a non-binary trans person. I didn't have any language for myself as a trans person at all. I just knew I did not fit into the neat boxes that I was told how gender worked and that there was no variation from that. So seeing this pregnant man showed me, oh, I'm not alone. There are other people who don't fit into these boxes. I'm not the only one. Now, where it turns negative is how he was treated by the media. He was very much misgendered, very much referred to as, oh, he's not really a man, he's actually a woman, which is gross and rude. But on top of being misgendered, he was also dehumanized, where it went to not just, oh, he's not really a man, he's a woman, it's he's not even a person. So on the one hand, I was shown, hey, you don't have to fit in these boxes. You're not alone. And immediately also being told, and if you don't fit in these boxes, you will be punished for it. And there's something wrong with you. So that very much influenced my own, exploring and experience of my gender and the way I was taught to see other trans people as well. That took work to undo. The other example I want to share is that of a friend of mine. A year or so ago, I did a workshop that had this question. A friend of mine from college happened to attend this. She reached out to me after to say that I, like me as a person and our friendship, was her first positive memory of a trans person. And that was so sweet. That was like, holy cow, to be that person for someone. She was 20 when we met. And this is not her fault. This is not a criticism of her. Prior to meeting me, she had never, had the opportunity for positive interaction with trans folks. She'd only been shown negative media. Like I said, that's not her fault. But obviously that's heartbreaking for her and heartbreaking for trans folks. We are getting better media representation. It's still super limited. But so I share this to really emphasize that, again, we can't decide how we were taught to view trans people. That's not something that we had control over. And we don't have time machines. But we can make the choice to learn and to grow. So I want to talk about gender and sex because these are things that come up a lot when we're talking about trans folks. So these are things that are different, but they are connected in some ways. So in this context, when I'm talking about gender, I am talking about an internal part of our personal identity. It's just a part of who we are. In my case, my gender is, well, honestly, it's a lot of adjectives. I am non-binary, I am trans, I am genderqueer. Identity labels are adjectives first and foremost. In this context, sex is being used to refer to some physical characteristics. We have primary, quote unquote, primary sex characteristics like hormones, chromosomes, genitalia, things like that. But there's also what we call secondary sex characteristics where things might get a little more loosey-goosey, like height, like body hair distribution, things like that. When we take those into account, we can see how it's maybe not as cut and dry as we're taught. Some things that these both have in common is they are both socially constructed. Now, when I say something's a social construct, that doesn't mean it's imaginary. That's a lot of people's first assumption. Money is a social construct. It does not have inherent value. The meanings that it has are meanings that we as a society have assigned to it. So that's what I mean when I say that these are social constructs. In the case of gender, it's a socially constructed role. So the ways that we do gender, the ways that we understand gender are very much subjective and very much part of our culture. Additionally, again, it's still that internal identity because nothing with humans is cut and dry. Everything is complex. Similarly, like I said, sex is socially constructed. Now, that doesn't mean genitals don't exist. They certainly do. But the meanings we've assigned to them, what counts as what, the naming of categories, these are things that we as a society have created. So similarly, both of these things are constructed and largely seen as a binary in our society. So binary meaning having two categories in the context of gender, masculine, feminine. In the context of sex, male, female. Now, a little bit of a side note on that, technically male and female are supposed to be non-gendered science-y words. They're not. They're still very gendered in the English language. Another thing that these two have in common is that even though our society treats them as a strict binary, diversity has always been observed in humans in both. In the context of gender diversity, there have been cultures across the world and across time that have, recognized gender as not a binary system. In some cultures, that is a third gender category, like the Hijra or the Kanar in India, depending on what region you're in. But then there are also cultures that have, 4, 5, 6 distinct genders with their own roles and rules in the culture. And even cultures that don't really have gender, that it isn't something as important, or even if gender is a thing, it doesn't function the same way as it does for us. So in English, we use pronouns to communicate gender, like he or she. But there are a lot of languages that pronouns don't communicate gender, they communicate age or relationship with the person. Similarly, the binary that our society uses for sex is male and female, but there are plenty of people who don't fit into those neat categories. Those folks who don't fit into those are considered intersex, who I'm going to talk about more in the next slide. And again, these are viewed as really strict checkboxes and are conflated with each other. So some terminology, this is non-exhaustive. So I've been using some language. If you've been confused about what words mean, I'm on it, don't worry. So transgender, often shortened to trans, this is someone whose gender is different than what they were assigned at birth. So baby is born, doctor says it's a girl. And at some point in that person's life, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 15 years, maybe it's 50 years down the road. They realize, actually, I'm not a girl, I'm a guy, or I'm non-binary. Basically anything other than what it was they were assigned when they were born. Cisgender, often shortened to cis, is just someone who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. So again, baby is born, doctor says it's a girl, and throughout that person's life, they're like, yep, got it right on the first guess. Continues to identify as a girl or woman. So non-binary, this is someone whose gender is not binary. It is right in the name. It's really straightforward. It's one of those that people assume is more complicated than it is. This is both an umbrella term and a personal identity label. So it describes any identity that's not binary, so not like man or woman, but it also functions, again, as that personal identity label. So like I said, I use it for myself. I describe myself as non-binary. I also describe myself as genderqueer. Genderqueer is a personal identity label that falls under the non-binary umbrella. And then intersex describes someone who doesn't fit into the neat male or female checkboxes that our society has made. This can be due to, variations in genitalia or hormones or chromosomes or even internal organs. I bring these folks up for a few reasons. One, intersex folks make up about 2% of the population. That does not sound like a lot. That's the same percentage of the population that has red hair on average. If you think of every redhead you've ever met or just seen at the grocery store, that's how many intersex folks you've come across, even though they may not know it. The other reason I bring this up is intersex folks face a lot of oppression, and their oppression can very much overlap with the oppression that's targeted at or at least experienced by trans folks. So being intersex, different than being trans, people can be both. But our communities are very closely connected. So I like to use this color wheel analogy to get a good understanding of how gender is experienced in complex ways. So we are going to assign pink to masculine and blue to feminine. That's not just to switch things up for fun, though it also accomplishes that. Roughly 1900 to 1940 here in the US, pink was considered masculine and blue was considered feminine. And then in the 40s, they switched. The reason they were gendered in the first place was actually a baby clothes marketing thing. That's a topic for a different day. But I like to use that example because I know the way I was taught to view gender was that blue is inherently masculine. And no, it's not. That's new from the 1940s, at least here. So we're taught to view gender as we have masculine over here and pink over here, and they're totally different and never the twain shall meet. And then the next step is, okay, so we have masculine pink here and feminine blue here, and they have purple between them. And that's where non-binary people are. And all non-binary people are a mix of masculine and feminine, which isn't actually true. Plenty are, nothing wrong with that. That's why I like the color wheel. So you can see that we have endless shades of pink and endless shades of blue and endless shades of purple between them. But we also have countless reds and oranges and yellows and greens and that quasi gray in the middle. And this is how to think about gender, at least how I think we should think about gender. Yes, we have masculinity and femininity and combos of that, but we also have experiences of gender completely separate from that. Sometimes that can be hard to conceptualize because our culture is very married to the gender binary, but I find this visual to be helpful. This is the gender possum. I made it because I needed a graphic to help. It's just basically a worksheet, and I like possums. Possums don't have anything to do with trans folks other than I am trans and I like possums. They're North America's only marsupial, and I think they're quite cute. And they can't get Lyme disease or rabies, so that's neat. But no, possums aren't trans. They don't have a concept of self. If you've ever seen the gender unicorn, this is essentially that, but different animal and pronouns added on. So, there are pronouns listed: she, her, they, them, he, him, zir, and other. There are other pronouns that exist, especially when it comes to neo-pronouns, newer pronoun sets like zir. One I didn't include was here, here. People will sometimes say, well, Aspen, those are made up words. They're all made up. That's how words work. We did not pick them off of the organic word tree. We all made them up. That's how language is. So one of the reasons I also include pronouns on here is they're a very important part of respecting people's identity. They are also not everything, and people relate to them in personal ways. So, we tend to think of she as being for women and he as being for men. That's true for a lot of folks, but I know people who aren't women who use she, her pronouns. I know people who aren't men who use he, him pronouns. Additionally, it's not like they, them pronouns are for genderqueer people and ze, zir are for agender people. It's about using the pronoun that best resonates with that individual. It's sort of like first names. You do not need to go out and memorize every single first name that exists and how to spell the variations. That would be a lot of time. But if you meet someone named Amanda, you learn how to say Amanda. You make sure you call that person Amanda. You do not call that person Greg because it is less syllables and because it is easier to spell. You call that person Amanda. Next on the gender possum, we have assigned sex at birth. This is, a part of who people are. This is included because this worksheet can be used kind of like personally for your own exploration. Please don't ask strangers or just anyone who wouldn't be cool with it about what kind of genitals they have. That seems like a silly thing to point out. It's a very important thing to point out. I have been asked about my genitals at workshops I've led. Don't be that person, please, and thank you. Then you can see we have gender identity. We have female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, non-binary, gender non-conforming, other genders. If someone is like using this as kind of an exploration tool, what they would do is mark where they fall on these different arrows. And same with gender expression and presentation. And you may be thinking, oh, well, why is gender expression separate from gender identity? And that's because they are different things, because we relate to gender expression in different ways. So I'm going to talk about pants. Remember how I talked about a lot of things with gender expression are very culturally bound to time and to place. So it is 2022. Pants in our culture are generally considered a unisex article of clothing. Obviously, you'll have variations in cut and material and pocket size, but pants are generally considered to be a gender neutral article of clothing. Traditionally, they are a masculine article of clothing. If I hopped in a time machine and went back 100 years, pants would very definitively be considered masculine to the folks I talk to. That does not mean that I go up to a group of people all wearing pants and say, oh, you're wearing pants. Those are traditionally masculine. You must be men, because that would be silly and also weird to do. The reason I bring this up is trans folks often have our gender expression policed. So what that can look like is if you have a trans woman, so someone who is a woman, in her case, assigned male at birth, but then it was like, nope, doc was wrong. I'm actually a girl. When trans women don't perform femininity hard enough, like if they decide to not do their makeup that day, or they decide to wear pants, they will often be told, oh, well, clearly you're not a real woman. And that's not an okay thing to do. Something that I run into in my own experience. My own gender expression ranges from what I would describe as like very butch to very femme. So sometimes I wear dresses and, people will be like, well, Aspen, why are you wearing women's clothes? They're not women's clothes. They're my clothes. I bought them. They're in my closet. Because I own them, they're non-binary clothes now. So it's important to, one, that let everyone have their own, you should be able to express your gender in the way that feels right for you, but also to remember that how other people express their gender isn't necessarily our business. So on to pronouns, because this is something that I notice sometimes people struggle with. Honestly, what I've realized, most people struggle because they've psyched themselves out. They've been told that it's hard. So when I, first started realizing my own stuff with gender, realizing I was trans, it was being in community with other trans folks. And it was before there was a lot of visibility around trans folks. It was increasing, still not a lot. And I had never heard the idea that learning people's correct pronouns was hard. So it wasn't hard. It was easy. I'm like, oh, this is just a thing we do. It's, similar to learning a new person's name, but honestly, a little easier to remember because I'm atrocious at names. But I've noticed over the years that a lot of people will come to me and they'll be like, oh my gosh, pronouns are so hard. And I'm like, who told you it was hard? And I've realized it's not that it's inherently hard. It's, if you're told something's difficult, it becomes difficult. So one example I like to use is actually my own grandmother. She has been really supportive ever since I came out to her as being trans. I finally came out about 3 years ago with deciding to change my name. And she has not slipped up on my name change once. And she has only slipped up on my pronouns, 3 times-ish that I'm aware of. She had known me for 2.5 decades, and she was already 80 when I came out to her. She didn't have exposure to trans people separate from me. So she had never had someone tell her, oh, learning your grandkids' pronouns is hard. So she never had a reason to think it was hard. And so for her, it was really easy. Sometimes also when I tell people like, hey, I don't have a hard time with it, they'll assume that it's because I'm trans. It's not inherently easier for us to respect other people's pronouns or to learn them. It's just that because we have experience being misgendered, it's easier for us to recognize the importance of it. Singular they, them is correct. You already have experience using it. If you were at the grocery store and you found a phone on the floor in one of the aisles, you'd probably say something like, oh no, someone forgot their phone. I hope they come back for it. Maybe I should bring it to customer service so they can find it and no one steals whoever's phone this is. In that sort of context, we don't question using singular they. So it is a thing we all have experience with. Again, where people struggle is someone told them it was hard. And so they were like, oh, well, this person knows more than me, so it must be hard. I'm going to talk more about singular they in the next slide, but I think what's important to know is that pronouns are base level respect, like bar on the ground respect. Using the right ones are still important, but we need more than just this. Again, it's very similar to using someone's name. Like when I call Kate, I don't get an award for not calling Kate Megan or something like that, It's like that. So, because I care about linguistics, I always like to bring up that singular they is grammatically correct. It's been used by Shakespeare as a singular gender neutral pronoun, Oscar Wilde. It's in the current Merriam-Webster dictionary and several other dictionaries as well. Also by Charles Dickens, Emily Dickinson, Jane Austen, both of the Bronte sisters. If you look for classic English literature, you will find singular they. The reason we tend to think it's grammatically incorrect is this one dude who decided he was very self-important in the late 1800s decided that singular they was not correct because if you are talking about someone and you don't know their pronouns, you can just assume it's a man because only men do things. So not only is this idea of singular they being grammatically incorrect, it's rooted in vintage misogyny. And like I said, we have experience with it and language is made up. We can change the rules to benefit people. We don't need to disrespect people for the sake of silly grammar rules that aren't actually correct. Also, singular they has been in the English language longer than singular you. Venn diagram. I love me some Venn diagrams. This just shows kind of the overlap between abortion care and reproductive justice. Trans, intersex, and queer health. Important to note, trans and intersex folks are in the queer community, but I just wanted to note them specifically. And that overlap of LGBTQIA plus people who have abortions, plus the overlap of this is all important in the realm of autonomy and people having control over their bodies. So reproductive justice, if folks aren't familiar with, this is something from Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. They define it as the human right to maintain personal autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children that we have in safe and sustainable communities. I do have the link right there to their website if you want to check them out. I adore them. This term was created back in '94 by a group of Black women. This was really focused on the fact that the women's right movement at the time really centered and still centers white, middle to upper class, cisgender, heterosexual women, and ignored and still ignores Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, disabled people, trans people, and more. Obviously, focusing on just abortion is important sometimes. It's a thing I care about a lot. It's a thing I do a lot. But it's important to remember where abortion fits in the whole realm of reproductive justice. Because if we only care about abortion, we are leaving a lot of people behind. We are leaving, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who have faced forced sterilization. We are leaving behind disabled people who have experienced forced sterilization and for whom in most of the United States, it's still legal to do. We are ignoring the unjust removal of people's children from their homes because they are marginalized, particularly, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So we have to remember this whole picture. Like, yes, we need to talk about abortion, and we also need to talk about where it fits in reproductive justice. This is from Liberate Abortion. I love them. They make good graphics. Everyone deserves access to the abortions they need on the timeline they want in their own communities and with a provider they trust. Liberate abortion everywhere. This sums up pretty much everything and how I feel about access to abortion care. Access to self-managed abortion through, medication abortion is really important, especially in states that are, passing abortion bans. It's really important as far as access. But, people should be able to access in-clinic procedures if that is what works for them. They should be able to work with a provider they trust if they want to be working with a provider. And so it is really, even when we're able to get people abortion access in states that have passed bans, it's still a huge, huge issue of people not getting the abortions that they deserve and that they want. So why does language matter? Obviously, we're moving more into talking about abortion now. So first, everyone who needs abortion access deserves to be a part of the conversation. I'm someone for whom abortion access is really important to my health and to my well-being. When people have conversations around abortion and they, frame it as this is something only women have, then they are doing a couple things. They're saying that I'm not important, that my access isn't a priority, but they're also misgendering me a lot of the time. They're saying, oh, well, you are essentially a woman because you could need abortion care. And neither of those are fair things to do to me or to other trans folks. Additionally, using inclusive language is more accurate as far as, including trans folks, but it also decreases stigma. When we say things like women's health care and a woman's choice in reference to abortion, we're being really vague and we're avoiding saying the word abortion. And when we avoid saying the word abortion, we are saying that there's something wrong with the word abortion, that there's something wrong with abortion, and that this is something that should have stigma, that it needs to be kept hush hush. And that is not true and has not served us well as an approach. Additionally, women's healthcare is very vague. If a woman breaks her leg and needs to go to the ER, like she's a woman, she's getting healthcare, that's women's healthcare. If a woman is making a choice between vanilla or chocolate ice cream, she's a woman, she's making a choice, that's a woman's choice. If we're talking about abortion, let's talk about abortion. I understand totally why there is this resistance to it. This is also one of those things that I wasn't necessarily super resistant to, but when it was pointed out, I felt a little defensive, some years ago when I realized that I would avoid saying abortion. And a lot of that is because we've sort of let the anti-abortion people control the language around abortion. And because they have framed abortion as this bad and scary thing and a bad and scary word, that we have accidentally reinforced that by avoiding saying it. Something else that comes up, around anti-abortion people and language is I'll hear folks say, oh, but the antis are targeting women, so we should reflect the language they use. Why? Why should we use their language? Why would we let them consciously shape our language when we don't share values around pregnant people being people? And it's also not like the anti-abortion people only want abortion to be illegal and unsafe for cis women who are trying to get abortions. It's not like they're like, oh, a trans person getting abortion, that's fine. We're totally cool with that. No, they just don't see us as we are. They see trans people who need abortions as women. Why would we want to join them in being transphobic? Answer, we don't really. Now, again, I do understand this instinct of they're targeting women and we should reflect the language they use. I get that initial instinct. But again, why would we want to share language with people that we don't share values with? This isn't to say we don't ever talk about women, because women are great. We should talk about women all the time. But we should be cognizant. We should be really thinking about, where are we bringing in gender, and does it make sense where we're doing it? Speaking of stigma, abortions, emphasis on that S, making it plural. This is something that I also hadn't realized I was doing. There's a lot of stigma around people who have more than one abortion. There shouldn't be. Abortions are healthcare. We should not judge people for needing to access healthcare more than once. And there really should be no shame or stigma around folks who have multiple abortions. And so that's something I work really hard at, to be cognizant of, like, does it make more sense to put the plural here? Or does it actually make sense to put singular? Or am I letting, internalized stigma control the conversation? Additionally, the idea of being pro-abortion. This is also something that, when this was presented to me as a positive, I initially was very defensive and resistant to. Like, I will be the first to tell you that. I absolutely used to be one of those people who was like, oh, well, I'm not pro-abortion, I'm pro-choice. Because it didn't really occur to me how rude, how stigmatizing that is to say. Now, I'm not telling people what language they should use for themselves, but I want you to think about this, because I've realized I am pro-abortion. I am pro-abortion the same way that I am pro-home birth, pro-hospital birth, pro-epidural, pro-C-section, pro-vaginal birth with no meds, pro-thyroidectomy, pro-heart surgery. Because I am pro people getting the health care they need. And when we say we're not pro-abortion, when we say that the idea of being pro-abortion is bad, we're saying that the idea of accessing abortion is bad. I'm going to use the thyroidectomy example. One way I see this come up also is, people will say things like, oh, it's fine if I want people to have access to abortion, or it's fine if you have an abortion, but I would never have an abortion. What? That's a very high horse way to approach it. It's putting a lot of moral feelings on access to abortion care. It's, saying that is essentially saying, I would never do this because it's bad, but it's okay if you do. And that's really not helpful for folks who do have abortions. I mentioned being pro-thyroidectomy. I myself had a thyroidectomy because I had thyroid cancer. If someone were to say to me, oh, it's fine that you had a thyroidectomy, but I could never have one, we recognize that that's weird and rude. We recognize that it's ignoring that there are many reasons people access healthcare. So just like, again, obviously it's a different context, but just like you wouldn't say that to me, we shouldn't say, oh, it's fine if other people have an abortion, but I never would. Because really all that accomplishes is reinforcing stigma. So one thing that I think is important to bring up is that it is not a coincidence that politicians are targeting trans rights and abortion rights. Really, most of the same states that are passing anti-abortion laws are also passing anti-trans laws. Texas is just one example of that. They obviously put their horrifying 6-week ban into place, which of course is targeted at women, but still impacts trans folks who need abortions. And they are also, trying to make it so that trans youth cannot access gender affirming care. They're also trying to make it so that no trans people can access gender affirming care. Minors are just an easier target to go after. And it's, remember the Venn diagram, it is because trans health and trans rights and abortion access are both strongly rooted in bodily autonomy. And basically in people who are not white, cis, straight men having control over their lives. So fighting for gender liberation and abortion justice. Again, it all comes back to autonomy. Obviously, I have hammered that point home, but it's really important to keep that centered. Also asking, what are we doing to make safe communities for trans folks and for abortion access? Do the people in your life know that you are a safe person to talk to when it comes to these? Obviously, like I mentioned, we are an abortion clinic at Mabel Wadsworth Center, and I have had to help a couple folks with navigating rides so that they can get to our clinic. We are the northernmost clinic in the state that does the in-clinic procedure. So we have people who have to drive 5 hours one way to get to us. And that's a huge barrier. And so I have to work with folks. And I remember there was this one client who I worked with. I'm gonna spoil it. It all worked out. She got in, got the care she needed, got home, doing well. And she, was talking to me, and she was so scared because she was newer to living in this community. And she was scared that if she asked anyone she knew for a ride, that not only would they not give her the ride for her abortion, but that they would shame her and that they would tell her that she was doing something bad and that she would lose the bit of community that she built. Now, like I said, it worked out. She actually got a lot of support. But, it was so hard for her because she had to really go out on a limb to know that she had a safe person. I mentioned my grandmother, prior to coming out to her, I wasn't sure if she was going to be a safe person. That is something that can be really hard to gauge. And so it can be really good to let it be known that you are a safe person. Challenge transphobia and any anti-abortion attitudes. What do I mean by transphobia? That's something that comes up. First off, transphobia does not mean that you are scared of trans people. It does not, as ironic as it may sound, mean that you think I'm in your closet and I'm going to jump out and scare you. No. Phobia can mean fear. It also means aversion to. So if you have a hydrophobic fabric, that doesn't mean that the fabric is afraid of water. Fabric doesn't have fears. It means that it's water resistant or it is averse to water and it won't absorb it. So transphobia is very overt things. It is like if someone says, hey, Aspen, I hate you because you're trans. It is things like transphobic hate crimes. It is refusing to provide healthcare to trans people. But transphobia is also more covert things. It is the way our society assumes everyone is cis. It is the way it frames being cis as being normal. So that is important to keep in mind. I also want to, really think about when we're talking like anti-abortion attitudes, that includes the people who protest outside of our clinic every Tuesday, except not today because it's raining. Those are people who obviously have anti-abortion attitudes, but it's also just contributing to stigma, even if someone doesn't mean to. So if, you're talking with a friend about abortion and they say something about like, oh, abortion is fine, but, if they have more than one abortion, that's bad. Challenge that. If it's a friend of yours, hopefully you can have a good conversation around it. But it's not just the people trying to ban it. It's anything that is, contributing to stigma. Obviously, of course, oppose any laws that try to limit autonomy, whether we are talking abortion bans or restrictions or bans on gender affirming care. And of course, support abortion clinics, especially indie clinics. Independent clinics perform more than half of all abortion care in the country, but they don't get as much attention, which means they tend to not get as much funding. Also support abortion funds. Abortion funds pay for people's abortions, and also they can help pay for travel, staying in hotels, things like that. That's particularly important in southern states that we're seeing these bans come up in. So like in Texas, those abortion funds are helping get people to other states so they can get the care they need. And of course, supporting trans-led organizations that advocate for trans folks. Here in Maine, that would be like Maine Transnet, but there are, other organizations as well. That's just one that I'm very fond of and also on the steering committee of. I really like this graphic. I just really like the graphics that Liberate Abortion makes. They're very pretty, but yeah, grow abortion power, support abortion providers, support abortion funds, be a knowledgeable person who can connect people to resources when you can. Be a person who's willing to talk about abortion and help to fight stigma. With that, I want to go into questions. There, it's showing me we have 50 things in the chat. I don't know how many of those are questions and how much is conversation. Also, I'm going to stop screen sharing. Okay, Kate's nodding. Yay.
Thank you so much, Aspen. Yeah, we had a lot of conversation in the chat, more so than questions. But I would like to invite folks to either share questions in the chat or you can unmute yourself, or if someone wants to sign a question, please let us know in the chat and we can make that happen.
Also, I have to say it's nice to see in the chat other people who remember the pregnant trans man, because a lot of the time when I talk about that, if I'm talking with other folks my age, they're like just young enough that they don't remember it, and I feel alone. Share the Venn diagram slide. Of course I will. I will do that now. Let's share screen again. Oh yeah, and the video will be available to people.
Are there questions folks have about, Aspen, you just shared so much with us. So I'm positive folks have questions, and just want to remind everyone of the really lovely community agreements that Aspen shared at the beginning. So questions are good and safe here. And also, if a question isn't one someone wants to answer, they always have the right to decline.
Questions, and also just if you have thoughts, that's also welcome.
Mm-hmm. I'll be brave.
Yeah.
Hey, I am Kaden. I use he, him pronouns. I just wanted to say thank you so much. This has been lovely to watch, to go through. I do a lot of trans activism at my work as one of the only trans people visible in the sector that I work in. And, in my case, I am the only trans person that a lot of the other organizations we work with have ever met. So being that positive experience and, getting that feedback that people are like, oh, trans people are just like me. It's beautiful. So I super appreciate, opening this and going over gender and sexuality and sex and all that. So thank you.
Thank you. And also, you bring up an important point that I sometimes forget to mention. So thank you for reminding me of it. I always feel really, well, in some ways honored, in some ways horrified. Like, how am I the first trans person that you've met? But so sometimes I feel really honored, but that's also a lot of pressure. So I think it's good to remember that if you meet a trans person, we can also have our off days, to not judge our whole community by us. Like, you know, if I'm in a grumbly mood, and I'm overtired, and, you know, I don't want the, you know, I'm still not going to be rude to the person at Dunkin', but if I'm not as perky as I usually am, you know, I would hope that the Dunkin' cashier doesn't think, oh, all trans people are grumpy. Or if I'm getting a hot chocolate, all trans people drink hot chocolate. I guess keeping in mind that, like, you know, we are not, you know, we're not a universal experience. We're all individual people. And so we all have our differences. And that's true in an incredible amount of ways.
Aspen, could we, if we're okay to pull down the slide again? So
yes, and I have something too. This is Jules.
Yeah, go ahead, Jules.
Yeah, and I just wanted to share a little bit of experience working with deaf people and some of the experiences that they've had with top surgery as well. And it's been a problem in the state where I live in. There's been a lot of barriers to people getting top surgery care and getting access to medications and support and gender affirming care. A huge barrier has been the lack of interpreting services provided to those people. So that's something that we've struggled with, is actually finding interpreters for trans people to get care, and finding interpreters that are competent with trans people's care. And so that has been a huge barrier for trans deaf people here in this community. Yes, so often that's something, you know, where I'll get contacted and they'll ask me about what to do and ask me to screen the person. And so I get it, you know, I understand that. So yeah, and it's, you know, it's hard to have to navigate all of those barriers, those judgments and everything like that, from having to go through that in society as well as the interpreter, and finding an interpreter who's able to be that communication specialist as well as somebody that is affirming themselves for deaf people. It's almost like, you know, another whole level that they have to navigate.
Yeah, that is very tricky. You know, it shows how layers of marginalization compound each other. Oof.
Yeah,
I had a solution.
Thanks for sharing that, Jules, and you know, also just that you reached out to GER to ask if we were going to offer interpretation, ASL interpretation, and you were the first person who reached out to us with that. And it allowed us to provide this event, but also to have a deeper conversation about what language access will look like going forward, right? And so I'm thinking about how the reason we wanted to offer this program on trans rights and abortion rights is because I started hearing more questions from cisgender people in GER about wanting to learn more about transgender folks, like wanting to understand there's a lot of language that is very common for younger people and for trans people of all ages that is not common for a lot of other folks, right? And so this event ended up allowing us to also bring in conversation about disability and deafness, and that just made it all the more rich. So I'm just really grateful for you reaching out to ask if we could be more accessible.
Yeah. Do you mind if I just add something as well? when I was getting involved with the networks that I work in 2012, finally, they were able to get interpreters in 2019. So from 2012 to 2019, there was no interpreters. And so that was something that I had to fight for. It was a huge barrier as a deaf person and a constant battle. And many deaf people have gone through this for their entire lives. And that fight is exhausting. And some people just at this point are despondent when it comes to that because they don't want to fight anymore. So, and I think that, you know, looking at Dawn, I think Dawn will agree with me that that fight can just become exhausting, you know, and we just kind of bite our tongues when we have to have that conversation again and again to say, where's the interpreter? And then some people will say, oh, we can't provide one, you know, or something like that. You know, there's no interpreter that we're able to get here. So it's just, yeah, I mean, yeah. So, you know, I think that's really the crux of my statement. So
yeah, and I hear you and appreciate so much the openness that folks are showing today in this conversation, because I think it's pretty clear the very difficult moment we're at politically in terms of abortion rights and access, trans rights, everything basically. We need solidarity between each other more than ever. We need to show up for each other, especially when we don't share all of the same experiences. And I think at GER, we're just really committed to trying to do better and better about bringing all of us along. We do want all of us to get to the world that we deserve. And we're not perfect, but it's really important that we seek to understand and be in cahoots with each other, because our opposition are very tight, right? They are very much in step with one another, and they understand that autonomy is important to both trans folks and all people who need abortions. They get that intersection very clearly, and we need to act as though we understand it very clearly too, right?
Yeah. I also want to switch gears a little bit to comment in the chat. I'll read out the whole thing. Yes, gender. Okay, actually, I will read it all because it's really good. I might skip some parts to shorten it. A thought I think of prejudice about trans/gender fluidity is based on misogyny, not respecting, even resenting women, and by extension, individuals who dare to behave as quote unquote women, you know, talking about like, you know, not basically that you're demeaning or being defiant of real men if you're not sticking to that strict cis binary, and how gender fluidity frees us all from gender behavior prisons. It's all misogyny. I do not blame you for getting spelling mixed up. Spelling is mostly fake. So yes, so yeah, you know, the way, I'm trying to think of words. Yeah, so I mean, even if we expanded a little bit beyond just looking at gender and also looking at sexuality, a lot of the like violence and homophobia targeted at even like cisgender gay men is focused on not performing masculinity in the ways acceptable to the patriarchy within our culture. And so, yeah, basically, if you don't fit into the narrow category of being a cis het white man, you know, there is this, I'm trying to think of how to, you know, just this misogyny, or sometimes I refer to it as misdirected misogyny, depending on who you are. Because if you're a woman, you know, then then it's regular flavor misogyny. If you are not a woman, but it's being directed at you, then I think of it as misdirected misogyny. Like, I'm not a woman, but people still, will be misogynistic at me. So it's a, misdirected misogyny, similar to like what trans men may experience. And then of course, there are other flavors of misogyny. There's trans misogyny. So the misogyny that is specifically targeted at trans women. And then there's, misogynoir, which is, the misogyny that Black women experience at the intersection of gender and race. So yeah, but it really is, we are all, very much connected by, if you're not a cis het man, being targeted by some flavor essentially of misogyny. I'm looking at comments.
If I want to lift up that while there's a lot of language that may feel new to some people, there are some really core concepts that you so beautifully encapsulated, Aspen. And one of those is this idea we can change the rules to benefit people. We created the rules, we get to shift them so that more people feel welcome, safe, and they are being respected. And another, this idea of autonomy, so much in the abortion rights world, we're talking about we need to trust people who have abortions that they know what is best for them. And it is the same rule around gender and sex and sexuality, right? I need to trust that I don't know someone better than they know themselves. And as long as I follow that kind of golden rule, it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. It means I don't have all that anxiety you talked about some people having. It's like getting in our own way when cis people could just say, oh, I believe you when you say who you are. And I will respect and listen to that. Just like I believe your reason for having abortions is as valid as anyone else's, and that you are the only person who could make that decision for yourself, right? And so that those core concepts you pulled out, I'm really grateful for them, because I do think some people got lost in the weeds of language that's new instead of the value of I respect you and I believe you.
Thank you for emphasizing. Yeah, I think that in all of these things, that I respect you and I believe you is so important. And one thing that comes to mind for me, jumping off point from a comment in the chat, which is not what this comment in the chat had said, just something that got my brain going. When it comes to, that trusting and believing people about who they say they are and what they know they need. When it comes to trans folks, one thing that I've seen specifically that comes up with, people who were assigned female at birth, I don't, at least for my own self and other trans folks, unless they indicate otherwise, I don't really refer to us as being female or female bodied, because I'm non-binary and all my stuff, like my hat and my glasses, they're mine, so they're non-binary. So so is my bod. But folks who are assigned female at birth and who are trans, will often be told oh, well, you're just being misogynistic. You just have internalized misogyny and you just hate women. And so instead of coping with that, you've opted to do this other way more difficult and dangerous thing of being out in trans, instead, which is always such an interesting thing to me, to kind of assume that that's the direction, because all of the trans folks that I can think of, like myself, I have someone very close to me who is a trans man. It's no, I love women. Women are great. I have no problem with women. I mean, there's, individual women I don't get along with because they are people. But as a concept, love women. And so this idea that to be trans is to hate your assigned gender at birth. And it's no, it just, sometimes people get things incorrect. And it's not any sort of, being trans does not make someone misogynistic. It doesn't mean they hate women. It just means that they love themselves and they want to honor who they are. So that's one thing that luckily I don't hear it come up as often anymore, but I think is good to still acknowledge, because it's something that can come up. And also just how within that, because we get told that, sometimes there's this pressure to hyper perform gender. You know, I know before I came out as trans, before I found the language, I was really hyper performing femininity in a way that did not honor who I was, but I was trying to force myself into a box. And I've also, you know, known trans women who before they came out were hyper performing masculinity, but then I've also known like trans men who were hyper performing masculinity when they did come out, because there's so much pressure on trans folks, both, you know, whether or not we're out, in performing gender correctly. And again, it all goes back to that autonomy. You know, just like how me wearing pants today doesn't make me a dude, me wearing a dress tomorrow doesn't make me a woman.
I want to pause and just see if there are questions at this point. And I put it in the chat, but if you have a question and you're feeling kind of nervous, you can chat it to me directly and I can anonymously share it. So I'm just gonna, if something shows up in the chat, we'll address it.
Yes.
Kate, along those lines, can you, Aspen, talk about how to make mistakes, like how to recover from mistakes, because inevitably you will misgender people or mispronoun people. What should someone do?
Yes. Okay. So thank you also. I appreciate how you presented it as a win, not if, because it is a win. To err is human. One of our strongest skills is doing things wrong. So what you want to do is just like be a normal person about it. What do I mean by that? As someone who's a very abnormal person. So Kate, I'm going to pick on you again with the stepping on your foot analogy. If I am walking by Kate and I step on her foot, a normal reaction would be, oh, sorry about that. And then don't do it again. Check to make sure like, oh gosh, you have sandals on. Are you okay? You know, check in. You know, if she seems fine, be like, oops, my bad. If she seems like I really did some damage, address that. Yeah, sorry, Kate's toes. Now, if I'm walking by Kate, she's wearing closed-toed shoes. Hell, she's wearing steel-toed boots, we'll say. So we know this is going to be fine. And I step on her foot with my Crocs, which are not very strong. And I react with, oh my God, I am so sorry that I stepped on your foot. I didn't mean to do that. You know, this is really new to me and I really hope you don't get mad. What? That is not how we apologize. That's not how we do this. If I reacted like that to stepping on Kate's foot, I have now put her in a position where she feels, yes, don't make it someone's problem that you made a small mistake. I have put Kate in a position where she has to comfort me and she has to reassure me, no, it's okay, I'm fine. No, you didn't do anything wrong. Like, no, we don't react. You wouldn't react like that to anything else. So don't react like that to pronouns. Now you might be thinking, Aspen, you're being over dramatic. Most of the time, yes, I am. I mean, I'm a little like I'm dramatic in a fun way. But I have had people react like that when they have misgendered me. People who should have known better. And I'm just like, I don't want to comfort you through this. Like, I actually didn't care that much, but now that you reacted like this, I a little bit want to fight. Like, what's going on, Barbara? Not a specific example, maybe, but so, you know, really think about like, how do you handle situations where you make mistakes normally? So first off, obviously, try not to. If you are really struggling with someone's pronouns, it's good to analyze why you're struggling with it. Because a lot of the time, what it comes down to is that you are not seeing that person for who they know themselves to be. Like that is something I've noticed. When people struggle with my pronouns, it's because they don't see me as the person I've said I am. They refer to me as a woman because they see me as a woman, because they have prioritized their interpretation of me over what I've described as my reality. Now, it's usually subconscious. And once they are consciously aware of that, they're able to make progress. So, be willing to analyze your own subconscious things. We are socialized into subconsciously assigning gender to people. And so it takes work to undo that. Recognize that it takes work. So definitely, analyze that. Have you decided what someone's gender is and that it's different from what they've told you? Don't be that person. Second, if you need to practice, do some practice sentences. You can do that while you're washing dishes, while you're driving, while you're multitasking, or you can sit down and focus on it like you're doing language learning. You probably don't need to, but if you feel like it. And then, just when you make a mistake, handle it like a normal person. First off, try to catch yourself. Try to be aware enough of the words you're saying to catch it, or words you're signing. And, to correct yourself, which if you make a mistake, it's like if I'm talking about Kate and I'm like, oh yeah, I saw him. I saw her yesterday. Depending on the situation, maybe talk to that person separately and be like, hey, sorry about that. I don't know what's going on with my head today. Maybe you don't need to do that. It's going to depend on your relationship with that person and the context. Again, try to correct yourself. If the person you've misgendered corrects you, thank them. So like, again, if I'm in a group, I'm talking about Kate, sorry, I'm picking on you today, but I just know you well enough to pick on you. If I'm talking about Kate and I'm like, oh yeah, I saw him yesterday. And then someone's like, oh, her, I'd be like, oh yeah, her. Again, if it's Kate who said it, I'd be like, oh yeah, thank you. If it's someone else in the group, I can also thank them, but I also would be like, oh yeah, her, emphasize that you've heard it. The reason I also bring up, if it's someone else in the group, if it shouldn't have to be the person who's being misgendered who has to make the correction. It should primarily, the first person who should be making the correction is the person who's making the mistake. But if they're not aware of the pronouns at all, they just don't know, or if, they just didn't realize they slipped up, the next person who should correct is someone else who's in the conversation who is not the person who's been misgendered. That's obviously going to depend on the conversation, who's there and who knows what. But if, let's say, my parents are talking about me, they're divorced, they don't talk that often, but let's pretend. Let's say my parents are talking about me, if my dad calls me she, my mom should be, you mean they, whether or not I'm in that conversation. It's equally important to do when the person you've misgendered is not there. Sometimes it can be even more important because if, it's sliding when the person's not there, it's also showing a pretty big lack of respect for who that person is. Like I said, there are times it's going to make sense to take the person aside later and apologize to them. There are times that it doesn't. There are times that depending on the relationship you build with a trans person, you may actually have to deliberately misgender them because of their request. I have a trans person in my life who is very close to me, who is out to a few select people and to no one else. He's working on it. But so when I talk to anyone that is not the people he is out to, I go back to she, her, and I go back to using his dead name. For me, it's not a hard change to make. It's very easy to make that switch. That's a position that a lot of people aren't going to be in. The people who are most likely to be in that position where they're having to switch back and forth is going to be other trans people who, have experience being in that position. But that's, when it comes to apologies or like mistakes, be a regular person about it.
Thanks, Aspen. So we're coming up on time And I just want to express to everyone here gratitude to Aspen. Thank you so much for sharing yourself with us and your knowledge. And I love the way you present information, so I'm really appreciative. But also want to extend an open invitation to folks within GER that if this presentation later on you're thinking on it and more questions come up for you, that please reach out to GER. If we will find you resources if you're interested in more reading or learning about this. This is not the only time we plan to focus on trans folks, obviously, and trans justice issues, but just want to extend an invitation that we're all in this learning together, and we want people to move into curiosity and even discomfort, and that we're open to it. And I'm here, so access me as a resource. And if I don't know the answer to something, I know a lot of wonderful folks who do. And also to just say that that trans folks are leading so many movements for justice in this country and in the world, and that whether people stand fully what being transgender is about. There is a quote from a sort of an artist and performer named Alok Menon, and they said, we have recently, this quote really resonates for me. They said, we have focused so much on comprehension to the detriment of compassion. So we have decided that it's more important that I understand you than if I just extend compassion and respect to you. And I don't need to understand you to believe that you should not be persecuted for being who you are. And so I want to invite folks to close on that, saying we don't always need to comprehend. That is a great goal, but we need to be focused on justice and compassion. And so those are the values that we're carrying forward in GER, and it's a learning process, but we're in it. And we believe this is the way we're going to win. So we will have this recording available, and I will send a follow-up email with some resources to everyone. But thank you so much to Aspen. Thank you to our amazing interpreters, and thank you to the folks who shared their experiences with us today. And we hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.
And thank you so much for having me. Do people want me to throw my email in the chat real quick?
I can send it out in the follow-up.
Yes, you can do that.
Awesome.
That will be
All
easier.
right. I'm going to end the recording now.